Clicker too. Cool. Good morning. Well, afternoon. So I'm aware that I'm between you and lunch, and I'm going to try to move through this pretty quickly because of that. Maybe we can catch up some time. I'll be here this afternoon, though, in and around. So if you have questions, please come and talk to me. Let's engage. Let's talk. I am the Community Planning Capacity Building Regional Coordinator for FEMA Region 8, which is the 6th state region, the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about community resilience, concepts, practice, and practicality. I'm also aware that we had an awesome presentation this morning from our colleague from Clark County, Nevada. So some of what I'm going to talk about may overlap a little bit with what she has experienced and presented today. What I'm going to ask you to do is kind of zoom that lens out a little bit, open the aperture. Let's try to get some depth of field to the issue of resilience is really what I'd like to achieve today. These are my objectives. Hopefully we can achieve them in this amount of time that we have. Again, if you have questions after this, please ask me. Also, this presentation is chock full of linkages to other resources, and I'll go through those, but if you can, and hopefully this will be available to you, but hopefully get a copy of the presentation, because it's useful to go through and kind of dig into some of the material. If you could indulge me for a minute too, I'd like to just kind of see who's in the room. I don't get up too often to talk to the emergency management agencies, so I always kind of like to figure out who's here. So who's a state employee? Just by a show of hands. State employees. Who's at the county level? Who works for a county? How about cities? Any city, maybe a couple of them. Tribal nations? Anybody from a tribe? Other federal partners? Got at least a couple here. Are you guys all National Weather Service? Yeah, okay. Everybody emergency managers raise their hand. This should be, who else is here? Anybody from, any city managers? Finance people from cities or counties? Fire? Public safety? Public health?
Huge public health.
Okay. Local hospital, okay. That's really helpful for me to understand, so thanks for indulging me a little bit there. You saw this before, and hopefully this isn't a new graphic for anybody. This is kind of FEMA's concept that we rolled out it's been about a decade now, about how recovery works, right? It's a matter of preparing for an event, having an event, and then working through these different time frames. I've augmented this slide a little bit to kind of give you some sense of how the family of disaster frameworks kind of fits into this. Are you all aware that there are 5 national frameworks, for one each for preparedness, mitigation, response, recovery, and protection? This was all driven by Hurricane Katrina and the follow-up legislation called Per Camera. The thing I'm going to talk about today is really this National Disaster Recovery Framework and its linkage to community resilience. I would be remiss, I'm sure if my hazard mitigation colleagues were here, or maybe some of you, if I didn't mention hazard mitigation, because it's up there as well. And I wanted to point out too that, really when we talk about the continuum of recovery, oftentimes months and years doesn't do it. Really, we're talking about decades or longer. We watched Hurricane, was it Maria, devastate Puerto Rico here about 2 years ago. It's going to be decades for them to recover in whatever form or fashion that looks like. So I think it's just good to understand that recovery can sometimes be a very long process, and your roles in recovery will change and fluctuate. I was amazed to hear Ms. Franklin, right, talk about her role as an emergency manager in what is that long-term sort of mental health and disaster crisis counseling activity that it sounds like they set up through that resiliency center that they created. That's really extraordinary from my perspective. For a team of 5 or 6 people in that county emergency management office to have the bandwidth and the dedication and the motivation to stay with that activity for 18 months, 20 months, I'm not quite sure how long, before they transitioned it over to somebody else is extraordinary. And think about how something like that might impact your agencies, your groups. That's incredible. But I think, too, that's why we categorize these things as disasters, because they're the thing that we couldn't anticipate, that we couldn't conceive of happening, and we didn't plan for it. If you looked at the National Disaster Recovery Framework, you would get this graphic, and it talks really about to 3 kind of key concepts in the NDRF, if I can use an acronym. Well, I'm FEMA, I can use an acronym, but I don't want to get too far ahead of folks. But those 3 key concepts are kind of illustrated here in these 2 areas, right? As a result of the NDRF, we created leadership positions in each of the 10 FEMA regions. And we've asked our states to do similar kinds of planning, create similar kinds of recovery or pre-disaster recovery plans or recovery frameworks, and to identify similar structures so that when there's an event, and typically these are going to be large-scale events because the NDRF doesn't often get activated, but we're going to look to connect with your state leadership in a way that supports and benefits the impacted communities. Another key concept illustrated here is this idea that it's not just FEMA coming to the table. We're actually bringing a partnership. You'll hear the term, if you haven't already, Interagency Recovery Coordination Teams, or IRC. That's the effort that FEMA has mounted with all the other federal partners and agencies to build capacity to come to communities post-disaster and help the state be as efficient and effective as possible in supporting locally impacted communities. This is not without complexity. This stuff doesn't just happen overnight. We've been at this now for going on 10 years. The NDRF was released in 2012. In fact, I was on a team in Minot at the time, that September that it was released, supporting the town of Minot as they worked through the impact of the flood that year, and we helped them and supported them in development of a recovery plan. But so those are a couple of the key concepts I'd like you to kind of think about. Really, for FEMA, it's all about coordination with the state or coordination with the tribal entity and supporting impacted communities. We don't typically come to your state unless we're asked, and once we're here, I think we're here to support your efforts. I mean, recovery is local, as they say. But let's talk a little bit about resilience. Well, actually, I don't know what I did with it's blinking 02. Try something here. I'll just use let me actually, before we go on to resilience, let me talk a little bit more about the concepts in the National Disaster Recovery Framework. Basically, they're here. The framework really talks about a variety of factors for successful recovery. These are probably pretty well understood by folks. Effective coordination and decision-making, integrating recovery planning processes, well-managed recovery. These are probably things that sound reasonable. Hopefully they do. But I guess the question is, are you prepared to do them in your communities? Have you thought through what that looks like for your community, what that structure looks like, who the personnel might be? I put this quote over here just to kind of provide some local context. Victoria Simonson is the city manager for Lyons, Colorado, And you can read the quote there. I mean, they went from $1 million budget to managing $75 million in grant dollars. They went from a staff of 14 to 48 at their highest staffing pattern. And the only way they could have gotten to that grant monies, to those monies that were so vitally important for their recovery, was to increase their staff, to build capacity. Yet increasing staff and building capacity was awfully difficult when you've just had 25% of your housing stock gone. Your community has been shut down for over 2 months. You don't have running water, sewer, power, communications. The town of Lyons, and I talk to anybody about that, it's a great example of the little town that could. You know, about 2,000 people, about I think 700 or 800 homes, and really a charming little town with a lot of grit. They had a lot more grit after the floods, but they had a lot of stick-to-itiveness. And it turns out a lot of community resilience. It wasn't easy, but they've built community resilience along the way, and they had some things going for them at the front end that really helped them. For whatever I've done to this, it doesn't work anymore. So just to kind of zoom out some more and think a little bit about the term resilience, we probably all know or think we know the definition, right? It's the ability to recover quickly from difficulties. There's a certain concept of elasticity around resilience. You know, scientifically, resilience is that amount of time it takes for anything vibrated to come to a standstill. So if you think of a guitar string or something like that, there's a concept of resilience in that. But of course, communities define resilience a little bit differently. And they all need to do it in their own language. And typically this definitional process is part of a planning process that a community would go through. Anybody familiar with the Rockefeller Foundation? Have you at least heard of them? Anybody? The Rockefeller Foundation, big, granted foundation developed by the Rockefeller family. Interestingly, does anybody know where the Rockefeller family got their wealth?
Standard Oil.
Standard Oil, yep, oil and gas. And here they are in the resiliency world. You know, they set up this program called 100 Resilient Cities, and they made dollar grants to 100 cities around the world to help those cities develop and forward their resilience, their concepts of resilience. So there's this body of knowledge now gained from 100 different cities around the world that's incredible. It's impressive, and we're going to talk a little bit about their kind of approach in a minute here. But if you're interested, I would offer that this is really interesting reading material. The federal government is no stranger to the concept of resilience either. NIST, the National Institute for Science and Technologies, who measure things, are interested in resilience. In fact, they want to figure out how to measure it. They want to help communities figure out how to do it so that they can measure it. But if you look at their definition, you see it's a little bit different than the Rockefeller one. Rockefeller's about surviving, adapting, and growing, no matter what kind of chronic stress. Here we've got prepare and adapt, withstand, recover rapidly. And especially important, I think, is this idea of bouncing forward, of not just returning the community to where it was, but rather pushing it forward and achieving an additional measure of whatever it is we're trying to achieve. So whether that's stronger buildings, whether that's safer schools, whether that's a walkable community, whatever these things look like, NIST is kind of taking that concept a little bit further. The last definition, kind of randomly, I'll put up here, is from Colorado. And what is significant about this, at least for me, it's got that rebound out idea and adapting to and thriving, but it's got a couple of other things I think that are significant. One is this idea of maintaining quality of life, healthy growth, and durable systems. and this conservation of resources for present and future generations, which when you hear that in that kind of language, it's typically sustainability language. So the state of Colorado is looking at resiliency, but it's also wrapping sustainability into that definition. The other thing that I think is significant, and I don't know if you guys picked up on this, we've codified it. It's actually in the state statutes. And that's I think, pretty incredible for our 6-state region. I don't know of any other state that's defined resilience or that's put the same amount of importance on it. And I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in Colorado. And then finally, there's just the simple idea of resilience, which is that life's not about how fast you run or how high you climb, but how well you bounce. It's how well do you bounce back? How well do you get over the things that happen to you, or use those things to move forward? We're still on defining terms, but I would be remiss if I didn't include something from academia here. From the Oxford Handbook of Urban Planning, we've got this great quote, and it's worthwhile for me to just read it a little bit. The process of building is necessary, but by itself insufficient condition for enabling recovery and resilience. Highways can be mended, office towers can be repaired, and communication systems can be patched back together. But a city is more than the sum of its buildings. It's also a complex, intermingled social and cultural networks. The messy, magical human software. Recovering this city fundamentally entails reconnecting severed familial, social, and religious networks of survivors, a process that cannot be imposed but must be cultivated from below, network by network, district by district, not just building by building. That's a really broad definition, right? And I'm so glad that my colleague from Clark County spoke this morning, because isn't that what she described her doing? Isn't that what that Resilience Center is all about? Is reconnecting and helping the community kind of recover. So when we as emergency managers think about community recovery, I think all too often we think about programs, and we think about grant dollars, and we think about the very necessary things that we have to do to get the money to achieve our goals. But there's also this other context of resilience and recovery. So here's a model, again from academia. This is a model of resilience in a community. It's from Planning for Community Resilience, a handbook for reducing vulnerability. And you can see that in this model, they've kind of separated the community out into 4 sectors, right, including social capital, human capital, physical capital, and economic capital. Very pedantic, very academia-oriented. You can get the paper and read this. It's an interesting read. I mentioned the Rockefeller Foundation, 100 cities before. This is their city resilience framework. So they've actually taken the input from those 100 cities, and they've digested it and thought about it and come up with this framework for city resilience, or a way to organize how you might approach building resilience in your city. Here you can see they've got 4 sectors on the outside ring, kind of similar, but a little bit different than the academic model. We've got leadership and strategy, health and well-being, economy and society, and then infrastructure and ecosystems. So they kind of follow that same idea. What's important too here is this inside gold ring. They've set up 12 goals, and they're goals that are pretty durable. I mean, if you read through them, effective leadership and management, empowered stakeholders, integrated development planning, and reading up in leadership and strategy, minimal human vulnerability, sustainable economy. Is there anybody here that could disagree with these goals? I mean, I'd be surprised if anybody would raise their hand, because we don't. I mean, cities, counties, states, units of government typically do things to perpetuate their existence and move the community forward. So this, for me, offers a really interesting model or concept for how one might practice resilience at a local level, how one might organize a community around the concept of resilience. Our neighbors just south of us, Colorado, I mentioned before that they codified resilience language. Well, they did more than that after the 2013 floods. They developed a resilience framework and this was actually efforts that were supported by FEMA and other federal agencies, but really driven by the state. They realized that they wanted something more than just a recovery strategy. They wanted it broader. They wanted it bigger. They recognized that the flooding of 2013 was not the first and not the last disaster that they're going to experience. They needed a context for helping communities in Colorado and citizens of Colorado, become more resilient. So they developed the framework. Their framework features 6 sectors, right? And I don't know. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but do these look familiar to anybody? They're kind of we didn't go over it a lot when we were talking about the National Disaster Recovery Framework slide, but they're kind of similar, very similar, in fact, to the recovery support functions. So you've got economic, you've got infrastructure, watershed and natural resources, housing, health and social, and a broader community component to this. And they also created a resilience office and then staffed it and funded it out of the general fund. So that's the level of commitment that Colorado is willing to do. So they coordinate and collaborate. They try to help communities bake resiliency into their community through a variety of methods, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But it's important to note that there's a state real close to you, colleagues of yours. Who have this experience, who are in the midst of this experience, and have great knowledge and understanding of at least how this is working in Colorado. At another level, a county level, Salt Lake County has done a similar thing, put together a resilience framework for their county. Again, here, Salt Lake County hasn't experienced a disaster, so the amount of effort and motivation and kind of stick-to-itiveness to put this together is incredible, because it's not easy to do this outside of a disaster, frankly. Yet that's the last time you want to be pushed into trying to do something like this. Salt Lake County took and used support from NIST, and on the right here is, it's probably impossible to read, but on the right here is NIST's suggested resilience planning process. They've got a variety of tools on the NIST website that can help communities do this. And NIST personnel are willing to engage you and talk to you about how they might be able to support. If your community has interest in this. So let's talk about actions. Because I think a lot of what you probably already do could be classified as resilience. And this is by no means an exhaustible list. It goes on and on. But let's just talk about the few things that are, kind of on the top of my mind as somebody from FEMA who deals with emergency management and disaster recovery all the time. Who has a hazard mitigation plan? Is there anyone who doesn't? Let me ask you that question. Anybody who doesn't have one? Fantastic. You maintain it, right? Have you implemented it? Have you done projects? Who's done a project? Cool. We actually have some people who've done projects. You'll be interested to know that the NOFA came out for 2019 for pre-disaster mitigation and hazard mitigation assistance. There's $410 million on the table in this granting round, which if you've looked at these grants before, you know that represents an extraordinarily increased commitment on the part of Congress to pre-disaster mitigation. I think they finally got the idea, at least this Congress, in their head that the dollar we spend ahead of time saves us money on the back end. We know that. We know that a dollar spent in mitigation saves up to $6 post-disaster. So, there should be no more business case to make other than that. So I would encourage you, if you haven't done a mitigation project out of your mitigation plan, pull it out, dust it off, take a look at what's in there, talk with your state folks here at DES, get engaged in that process. There's no better time than now. Who has a pre-disaster recovery plan at a local level, county or city? Anybody? Anybody thought through what you might have to do, like Ms. Franklin was talking about this morning? So there are some great examples of pre-disaster mitigation plans out there, and I'd be happy to connect anybody with some of these examples. If you're interested, I'd be happy to have a more lengthy conversation. If you already have one of the a mitigation or a recovery plan, I was going to ask who's exercised it, but it doesn't sound like we've gotten to that point yet. I will take my hat off, though, to the state, who I know this year, you guys have a recovery framework, which is essentially the state flavor of a pre-disaster recovery plan, and you guys stood it up and activated it, right, Kathleen? Which is extraordinary, because if we have these plans and we never exercise them or never implement the things in the plan, it's a paperweight. I mean, it fills a space on your bookshelf. Anybody adopt a pre-disaster recovery ordinance? Something that would give your community the powers post-disaster to do what needs to be done. There's the American Planning Association, which I've got a link to later on, has a draft of this. It's already written. It could be taken a look at by you, by your city or county attorneys, your elected leadership. But it gives you the ability to do things like impose a moratorium on building permits for a period of time post-disaster until the city or the county can get an understanding of how they're going to move forward. And oftentimes what we run into post-disaster is this urgency to repair and replace and get back to normal. At some level of disaster impact, though, there are other considerations that can and should be made if we're going to move forward from where we were before. So there's this tension between thoughtfulness and urgency. It's in that space that some of the disaster recovery ordinance can help with. Who has a comp plan in their county or city? Comprehensive plan or master plan? Anybody? Do you know? There's an awful lot of focus right now at FEMA on talking to communities about integrating planning, because the comprehensive plan kind of sets the stage for development in your community, as you know, and likely your community has a process through the planning department, through the building official, to figure out what goes where and how it gets placed on the ground. So coordinating and having the mitigation plan inform your comprehensive plan and your zoning ordinance and your building codes seems like a natural fit. NIST has a tool that will allow you to perform a community resilience screening. Pretty quick tool. You can score yourself and figure out where you are. That can be really helpful. Does everybody belong to the National Flood Insurance Program? Anybody not belong to the National Flood Insurance Program? Great. Who has not adopted a building code? You have not?
Except what you're saying, in the rural areas, we don't have any of that.
Not even at the county level?
Not even at the county level.
So no permits to pull, you just
Absolutely.
go out and build?
Have a nice day.
Yep. And you know, that makes a lot of sense in rural areas. The challenge, though, is that when we get these broad storms, like the ones that impacted North Dakota or South Dakota this year, those are the things that then get wet or get damaged or destroyed, and the challenge is to try to figure out what to do so that we do it better next time. And I would say too, it's important. And if there were a way for your county or your city to do those things, to adopt a code, to adopt a zoning code and administer it, those would be smart, resiliency kinds of actions to take. I'm not.
Well, no, we could get the
Yeah.
federal government's help. We just now finally got mapped. We've been members of it for 20 years.
Right.
We've never mapped.
Right.
So in going to commissions and saying, now we need to enact zoning just to get to the floodplain.
Yeah.
Well, that didn't go good at all.
Well, even a floodplain ordinance, not necessarily zoning, even a floodplain ordinance that maps the floodplain, it's going to impact property, but it's also has the kind of teeth in that ordinance that'll allow you to make some decisions about location, place, and manner of building within that floodplain. It's an extra level of regulation, I get that, but I also think that it's better than the alternative, to wait for the bad day to happen and then try to figure out how to save people's lives, their economies, and that's my opinion. But it seems like seems like you would do that. And so I'm not saying, hey, go zone everything. I understand that probably doesn't work at scale in rural environments. But I am saying take a look at the things that you're already doing that create resilience in your community. And then this last one I put up here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a second, and I know I'm about 3 minutes away from finishing. Consider specific land use tools to assist with building resilience. So if your community doesn't have a zoning ordinance, if you don't have a planning department, maybe this isn't very important, but there are a set of tools. And in fact, Colorado developed a tool post-disaster that can really help, and I'll give you the reference to that. That doesn't work, I keep forgetting. So in the slideshow, there's this slide, which with all the logos of all the different things that I've quoted or talked about today, each one is linked to their website or to the resource that I referenced. So if you can get a copy of the slideshow, or if you want to stop by, I'll give you my card, send me an email, I'd be happy to send you a copy of it. But I wanted to make sure that you had a resource today to, just to get back to the things that I talked about, if anything, caught your attention. I also provided a resource list, so it's pretty well documented, I think. A lot of different resources in here, a lot of links. The tool that I was talking about before, the land use tool, is this Planning for Hazards, Land Use Solutions for Colorado. For those of you who do have planning departments or understand what community planning is all about, you'll recognize this as a set of instructions or operations for taking commonly understood land use tools like setbacks, like overlay districts, and applying them in a hazards context. So, and it's really kind of slick. It's organized online by, you can either read the thing, you can go through it tool by classification of tool, or you can look at it from a hazard perspective. So if there was a specific hazard that you were really concerned about, you could click on that hazard and it would list all the tools that are applicable, at least in Colorado. There might be some calibration necessary for North Dakota because you might have different kinds of planning enabling laws and that kind of thing here. Some things might be possible in here that aren't possible in Colorado and vice versa. Anyway, it's an interesting tool, and I would recommend it to your review. And that's it for me. Hopefully it's been informative. Do you all have any questions for me at this point? Perfect. Well, thank you very much. Happy to be here, and I'll be around this afternoon. Please let me know if you have questions. Thanks a lot.